Good evening and welcome to the YouTube channel of the Instituto Cervantes and Manchester and Leeds. Today we have the honor to present the book by William Chislett, Microhistoria de España Contada por un británico. It is an excellent book which is in a very concise and entertaining way tells the history of Spain for more than 2,000 years. A book that has been praised by prominent personalities such as John Eliot, Paul Preston, and Felipe Fernandez Armesto. I will now introduce our guest. William Chislett is Senior Research Fellow at the Elcano Royal Institute. He was a correspondent for the Times in Madrid during the transition, and between 1978 and 1984, a correspondent for the Financial Times in Mexico City. He's author of more than 20 books, and he has been visiting a scholar at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, and at the New York University. He has also spoken at the University of Oxford, Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, Georgetown, and the London School of Economics. He writes opinion articles occasionally for El País and ABC. During the presentation, the audience can ask the questions through our chat, and at the end of our talk, I will ask myself to put the question to William Chislett. Welcome, William. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. First of all, tell us about yourself and how your interest in Spain came about.
Well, I first came here in 1974, having finished working for 3.5 years on a provincial newspaper in Surrey, which was my journalistic training. I went straight from school in the outskirts of Oxford onto a weekly newspaper, which in those days was the traditional route for journalism. Today it's become a bit more academic with degrees and all this kind of stuff. But I will still maintain the old system was actually better. And my then girlfriend, now wife, was head of English at the main English school in Madrid, and I was in darkest Surrey, and decided once I'd got my titulo as a journalist to come here for a holiday. But the holiday turned into a 4-year stay as opposed to a couple of months. Largely because I was convinced by various people, including the then chief correspondent of the Times in Madrid, that Franco really was going to die, which he did in 1975. And he said, it's going to be a major story, don't go back to England, come and work with me. So at the age of 24, I found myself working for the Times of London, which was not normal, and had a large part of the story to myself. I bought a cottage in the province of Cuenca, which we still have, and became fascinated by the whole Spanish process. We moved forward. I then went to Mexico for 6 years, and then to London for head office of Financial Times. I changed newspapers when the awful Rupert Murdoch bought the Times, and the Times has since gone downhill. And the Financial Times, in my humble view, is easily the paper that reports the world as a whole much better than any other paper. Although many people are put off by the word financial. And after 2 years in London in 1986, my wife and I, with 2 small children, decided that London wasn't really for us, although we had a lovely house on Clapham Common, which we wouldn't be able to buy today. But we could then. We bought it for a ridiculous price. We came back to Madrid in 86, 2 small children. 86, Spain, it was Spain's first year in the European Union. I felt it was a good time to come here professionally. I quit the FT, which my father-in-law thought was madness. For a year, I was the deputy editor of the English language service of FA, and FA hadn't really changed much, which is the National News Agency, hadn't changed much since Franco Day. And in 87, I basically decided to become self-employed. And I wrote a whole slew of books on various countries. Didn't do that much journalism. And then in 2001, when the Royal Elcano Institute was founded, which is Spain's first think tank, as we understand it in the Anglo-Saxon world, I was on the ground floor of that and remained with it. And they published 4 books of mine, and I write a monthly piece on Spain and many other things. And Spain is home. And incidentally, I can probably reveal a secret. I think, without spoiling my chances, that I'm in the pipeline to get Spanish nationality by the route known as Carta de Naturaleza, which is the fast-track route and which is a prerogative of the Spanish government, for which you need political support. It's not the normal way, which takes years. But this was offered to me, and I decided to get all the bits of paper together. And the foreign minister is personally backing my application. And Antonio Munoz Molina, the novelist and close friend, and a man who was King Juan Carlos's former lawyer, other distinguished people. So actually next week or next month will be Spanish. Yippee.
Oh, yes. Welcome. No, welcome to Spanish, to the citizenship.
I wasn't going to bother, but the offer was made, and I thought I'd be silly to turn it down.
Yeah.
My wife, though, doesn't get it with me. She then has to apply as the wife of a Spaniard.
Yes, yes. But after so many years in Spain, that would be very easy.
Yeah, and my children I have one son in Berlin with 3 daughters, another son in Mexico, 1 daughter. And quite honestly, the great advantage of having a Spanish passport for me, not only does it symbolically represent all I feel about the UK at the moment, i.e. the awful Brexit, but it means I can go to Germany for more than 3 months without having to have a special visa, which I might find myself doing in my decrepitude as old age sets in.
Thank you. So, so you came in Spain at the end of the Franco's era, and what was your impression of Spain when you first arrived in the country?
Well, I arrived with no Spanish to start off with. I never learned Spanish either you can tell from my accent, I never learned it properly, which is something I now regret, unlike my kids who are totally bilingual. Grey, sad country. On the surface, not a great deal seemed to be happening, but underneath there was an awful lot happening. Everyone knew that Franco was on his deathbed, or took a hell of a long time to die. If I look back on the amazing medical bulletins that kept being issued, from being serious to very serious to very, very serious to grave to very, very grave, to dead kind of thing. I just sort of fell in love with the place and all it represented, and was fascinated by a transition from a country that had an awful civil war to democracy, which it is, despite the claims of some. It has its faults, like all, including the UK. But I just became fascinated. I mean, I didn't like living on an island, which is one reason why I left the UK. That's just a purely personal thing. And I like being a foreigner in a country that's not my own. Although maybe I've been here so long now that I see it through Spanish eyes. I don't think so. I don't think I've lost that sort of, I will never be totally fit in here because I'm British and blonde haired and have a beard and blue eyes. But I just like studying another country through I suppose a different set of eyes to those of a Spaniard. I can, and I have worked in other countries, and so I can perhaps put it into context and see the country more clearly.
Thank you. So let's speak about the book and the format of the book. This book originally was the first, has an English version, was published in 2013. And it was named Spain, What Everyone Needs to Know. What about this form and questions and answers that was not so common in Spain? Can you explain about how was decided?
Yeah. Well, the book was the book was commissioned by Oxford University Press. It's part of a well-known ongoing series. So they have China, what everyone needs to know, marijuana, what everyone needs to know, the Vatican, what everyone needs to know, etc. And it's always in the same format. It is question and answer. That's how it works. I mean, the project's a bit ridiculous. The idea that reducing a country to roughly 60,000 words, you know, one has to accept is ridiculous. So, but that's it. You know, you can't argue with that's a series. It's quite a well-known series. It's quite a popular series. So there's no point me saying, well, actually, I don't like the question answer format, and I want to write 120 words, 120,000 words. You know, that's the bill. The Spanish version is slightly longer, probably about 10 or 15,000 words longer, but it's the same format. So it's a translation of the book, which came out in 2013, but with some updating where necessary, in inserts into the text, and then 2 chapters, if I remember properly, at the end, which are totally new, which brings it up to this year. So it demanded a huge amount of reduction of synopsis, and I had to make the difficult decision of what I leave in, what I put in.
Yes, of course.
Which lays me open to criticism quite easily. Why didn't I say more about the Roman influence on Spain? You know, why did I start in 711 with the arrival of Los Moros as opposed to another date? You know, all of that is valid criticism, but I had to start somewhere, and I had to make decisions. So I was responsible not only for the text, but also for the questions, obviously. Yes. And it went through a vetting process. OUP is sort of fairly serious.
Yes, that's what I found really good of the book, is that in so little space, it's so thoroughly resumed the history of the country with the deep knowledge that you can feel it, and you can see that when you read the book. And that is what I have to congratulate, because I can imagine it was very, very challenging, as you are explaining. Regarding the content of the book, do you think that's the fact that you are an Englishman or a foreigner, giving you more objectivity in describing and analyzing the facts of the Spanish history?
Sorry, I don't quite understand.
That's the fact that you are a British foreigner, giving you more objectivity in analyzing the facts?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Also, I started with the advantage that I had roughly 18 months at the end of the Franco regime, which I think was very important for someone writing a book about nature. You would have seen that although I reduce so many centuries of history to sort of 300 odd pages, basically most of the pages are dedicated to 20th century Spain. And I thought that was what would interest readers most, and I haven't changed that in the Spanish version. But with what I was able to put in the limited space to give the history of pre-20th century. But I think that one of the this sounds sort of rather arrogant. One of the good how can I say? Well, I put it another way. It's for some Spaniards, it's fascinating that the best book on Lorca was written by an Irishman, Ian Gibson, a close friend. The best book on Dali was also written by Gibson. The best books on the Spanish Empire are written by John Eliot and Henry Kamen, and I can go on. None of them are Spaniards. This has improved greatly the last 40 years. There are a lot of good biographies and books on Spanish history. But the people I just mentioned were writing these books in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I can't explain it except that, I don't know, something in British genes that makes us objective, or our education, or I don't know. I mean, and lots of Americans have also written books, but it's basically the Anglo-Saxon historians who have written, some of the key works on Spain in the last, key history books on Spain.
Yeah,
Not
that's
all,
very
not all Anglo-Saxons, but if you go through the list, and it's quite extraordinary how many have been written by Anglo-Saxon historians, American or British.
Yeah, the Spanish Anglo-Saxon did amazing job about writing about our history. That's very obvious. The book begins with two quotations, one from the philosopher Julián Marías, who says, I translate it into English, Spain is not so different, so special, as is so often self-servingly claimed. The idea that Spain is an anomalous country should be eliminated once and for all. And the other quotation, which serves to start in the book, is the slogan of the advertising of the 60s, saying that Spain is different. Spain is really different, you think so?
Well, all countries are different, and we can't.
Yes, but in the sense of the context of the slogan and then the idea of Julián Marías.
Well, I put these two quotes in as a sort of deliberate contrast. I mean, can find arguments for both of them. When the Spain is different slogan was produced, which was produced by Manuel Fraga when he was tourism minister in the 1960s, which was very clever and basically was the slogan used when Spain became, I think I'm right in saying, the first country, well, basically invented mass tourism.
Yes.
One could look at the figures and see this. It was very clever, and I don't know how many people came here because they wanted to go to a country that was different. But anyway, the slogan stuck and is still often quoted even today in articles that people write. The Julián Marías quote is a much more serious quote based on his reading of Spanish history, and he was a prolific writer, the father of Javier Marías. I think he's trying to tell people, I think he's trying to escape from the black legend, although he doesn't say it there. He does speak about the black legend in other parts of his work, i.e. that the black legend essentially was propaganda produced by Spain's Protestant enemies against a Catholic country at the time when it was, all powerful in the world. People can dispute that, but I think that's how I see the black legend, which has produced many books. And like the expression Spain is different, the black legend is still a term that is used today when people write about Spain, and often without much knowledge of the country's history. So, the Franco regime can be regarded as, 20th century version of the black legend, et cetera, et cetera. I made a conscious attempt to point out some of the things that aren't generally well known about Spain in order to show that it's not really that different from other countries, from things like it has a large group of multinationals that have been created in the last 30, 40 years, like many other countries with are very successful abroad, to we have a higher life expectancy in Spain than in Britain. Spaniards live a couple of years more than Brits do, and quite a few more years than Americans do, that kind of thing. And I can go on, but I don't want to bore people with statistics. You would have seen that in the book, there is what I think is a very interesting table I concocted comparing Spain in 1978 to Spain in 2019. 2019 being the last normal year in Spain because of COVID, which made 2020 a very strange year. And that table, I think, tells you probably more than 1,000 words. As Spain has progressed, good, bad, and the ugly.
Of course. So we have already mentioned that, but yes, to put the history of a country as Spain in 300 pages is very challenging. But what was the most challenging historical episode to write about, and why?
Well, probably the Civil War. I mean, Paul Preston claims that more books have been written about the Spanish Civil War than about the Second World War. So we're talking of hundreds of books. And I, reduced the Spanish Civil War to, I don't know, 4 or 5 pages. All I can say in my favor is that when Michael Portillo, who was half Spanish, presented the English version of the book at the Instituto Cervantes in London in 2013, he said he'd actually learnt something from those 5 pages as opposed to reading tomes of other books. I mean, to compress those 3 years was extremely difficult. And, that was the most challenging. What to put in, what to leave out, what importance to give to the Republic, to explain why this war started, why it lasted so long, all those kind of things. Other parts of the book were much easier.
I can imagine, yeah, Civil War effect. It's obvious. Yeah, there's a great deal of books published and with very different approach. So to put that in a few pages is real, very, very challenging. Hypothetically, what moment in Spain's history would you have liked to have lived through, if you could have that done?
Oh, probably the 1930s.
1930s.
Yeah, I think so. The beginning of the Republic, the Civil War. I don't think maybe I wouldn't like to have been actually physically here during the Civil War, but I'm a great fan of Arturo Barea, who you might know.
Actually, you were in the Cervantes Manchester speaking about Barea.
I curated the previous head of the Cervantes, Bonet, commissioned me to curate an exhibition on Barea.
Yes.
Blair was born in 1897 and died in 1957. So I would have liked to have lived part of the years that he lived. In his case, well, he went into exile in the UK in 1939, after spending a year in Paris in 1938. So yes, the 1930s would have been, I think, the most interesting period of Spain to have lived through. Well, maybe if I had lived through it, I might not have survived. Who knows?
One of the most interesting parts of the book is the explanation and analysis of the transition. How do you personally experience the transition? And above all, the attempt coup d'etat on the 23rd February 1981, because you were in Spain also.
No. I covered
you were not.
I covered the transition from 75 to 78. You mentioned I worked for the Financial Times. I joined the Financial Times in 1978.
Yes.
So the coup I saw from Mexico City. The transition which has now become quite polemical in the sense that quite a few people are beginning to unjustifiably rubbish it as not having been as successful as I would claim it was. Basically, people in Unidas Podemos party, none of whom, incidentally, were born when Franco died, and none of whom actually lived through the transition. So I think you actually had to have lived through it physically to actually be able to comment on it, as opposed to look back from today and say, oh, well, this hasn't changed or that hasn't changed. That is what really got me engaged in Spain, the transition. I mean, I came here with very little understanding of Spain, with virtually no Spanish. Incidentally, I taught English for the first 6 months I was here before moving back into journalism, and I was highly unqualified to be a teacher of English, down to confusing things like cojones with cajones. So I actually once told my students that, voy a abrir unos cojones as opposed to cajones. But anyway, it did actually improve my Spanish quite a lot, although, but it was a pretty embarrassing experience. I think the transition was a wonderful event. Apart from ETA, we shouldn't forget, and many people do, ETA killed infinitely more people after Franco died than it did before he died. I think the total death toll of ETA is like 860 odd, and around 60, if not fewer, were killed during the Franco regime, and all the rest were after Franco died. I mean, there were some very bloody years here. That basically was the main one. I still insist that the transition was peaceful, despite, in the sense that those who took over from Franco did not confront those who were calling for democracy. I mean, there was some amnesty demonstrations and police firing off rubber bullets and that kind of stuff, but very few people died in that kind of thing. But you had at the same time the ETA problem, the Basque terrorist group continuing its struggle, convinced, which only died out a couple of years ago. It was a top-down, with Juan Carlos as the motor of change, and a bottom-up with pressure from the streets. The two, I think, without both of them, the transition wouldn't have happened. And you needed someone to guide it from the top, and you needed pressure from the street level. And in '78, it produced a new constitution, which incidentally has now lasted 43 years, which is more, I think, than any other constitution in Spain's history.
Yes.
I stand corrected on that because I haven't got the figures in my head, but I think I'm right in saying that. So yes, successful.
Yes, and it brought also a whole change in the structure of the society with the new constitution. So have you observed, I suppose, a profound change in Spain over the last 30 years after the transition, from the moment of the 80s to today? Yeah. Spain has changed a lot. Yes.
Yeah, there is no comparison. An English novelist, Hartley, author of The Go-Between, said that the past is a foreign country, which is a line, I think, from The Go-Between. Well, Spain in the 1970s, when I came here, for me, is a foreign country. It's almost unrecognizable. It's a secular society, although the Catholic Church is still has undue sway in education, for example. But we are essentially a secular society. We have a vibrant democracy. We have 16 parties in the parliament at the moment. I would say too many, but that's what people voted for. It makes governing this country extremely difficult. It is the country's been devolved, the power has been devolved to the regions. One can question some of that as well, which makes the country even more difficult to govern. The standard statistics, TVs, cars, houses, all that kind of stuff, we're like any other European country and on those kind of levels. The health system here, which was almost started from scratch after Franco died, is very good. It's ranked considerably higher than the British public health system. Obviously, it's taken a knock from COVID. The family is still strong here, not as strong as it was maybe 40, 50 years ago, but considerably stronger than in Northern Europe. I once wrote an article that if grandparents went on strike in Spain, the country would collapse. Because I live it in the area where I live. I live in Salamanca in the center of Madrid, and I can see neighbors looking after their grandchildren in order for the daughter or son to work or to make life easier. And they take them often 5 days a week, which I think, generally speaking, it doesn't happen so much in the UK. So the family's strong here, which has enabled it in times of crisis, including the current one, to get through, particularly during the Great Recession after the collapse of the totally crazy property bubble in 2008. and it's an institution that, you know, will not, don't think will be substantially eroded. But I mean, that's a positive side. Unemployment is absurdly high here, and that's not the fault of the transition. The pension system here is in deep problems. That's not the problem, the fault of the transition either. The justice system is, in my view, can be perceived as being too politicized. That, to some extent, is a problem from the transition. Well, I'll end it there.
Okay. So you are a privileged witness of Spain and the society. How's your views on Spain changed over those years in the country?
Not really. I suppose the main view of mine that has changed is that I had huge admiration for the political class when I came here, from the communists to the then Popular Alliance, which is today the Popular Party, to the socialists, working together, sorting out the transition, sorting out Spain's entry into the EU, compared to the political class today, which quite frankly is abysmal and is a big problem here. Politicians are supposed to be part of the solution. In Spain, they're very much part of the problem. Now, I can say that about many other countries as well, but I don't live in other countries. And so Spain is the country that's closest to my heart. But we have a political class here that's simply not up to it. I mean, the most ridiculous squabbling has gone on over COVID, far deeper than what's happened between the Labour Party and the Conservatives in the UK. I mean, it would take too much time to go into it now, but I mean, the parliamentary debates on what should or shouldn't be done during COVID have been not a very appetizing sight. Spain will be the second largest beneficiary of the EU funds that are coming in from the Pandemic Recovery Fund. Similarly, debates on that also have not been, they've not produced any consensus, a word that is woefully lacking in the Spanish political vocabulary.
And also, as a witness, how would you define the Spanish people, the Spaniards?
Oof. They work hard, they play hard, they're generous, they are friendly. I mean, I don't have the same kind of relationship. I have a much better, difficult to say, relationship here with just the people I come across in my neighborhood, not my direct neighbors, but I don't know, the guy who repairs shoes, the people in the supermarket, the fruit person we buy from, that kind of stuff. You know, they're not close friends, but I have that kind of chit-chat, friendly kind of situation that I had when I lived in London.
Yes, the barrios, la vida de los barrios.
Yeah, well, Madrid for me has always been a collection of small villages or barrios. You know, so my barrio is one village, and the next Chambéry is another one, and Moncloa is another one, etc., etc. So yeah, my mother used to ask me when will I be coming back to the UK? I always used to fudge the question and say, well, you know, maybe after I retire, kind of thing. But I mean, having let the cat out of the bag on my Spanish nationality, which maybe if someone's listening to me, it will now be denied because but no one swore me to secrecy. So no, I am very happy that I moved here. And incidentally, it's been far easier for Brits in Spain to get what we call the Brexit card. Those of us who've been legally here, to convert our old residency paper or card into the post-Brexit card has been infinitely more easy than it has for Spaniards in the UK, which I take as a sign that Spaniards, you know, or the government loves foreigners, likes foreigners. Now, of course, they want to send out the right signals because tourism is such an important country here. And roughly 1/4 of the total tourists who come every year are Brits. 19 million Brits came to Spain in 2019, the last normal year. But I think that shows, I think that
yeah, 19 million. Hopefully they will come back again. I hope so, when this COVID will be over. And you are always very welcome. So we are finalizing our talk, and then we will open to the public questions. But let me finish with the last question is that after reading this book, we discover, Spaniards also, positive aspects of Spain that are sometimes overlooked. At the end of the book, there is a complete table that gives an account of this. According to you, in your book, you say we have plenty of reasons to love ourselves, Spaniards. Regarding this fact that there are positive things that we can go through very physically in this. For example, you mentioned some points, but we have, for example, another fact very important, that Spain is considered the first place in the quality of living from different analyses in different countries and different realities. So what do you think when we think about this reality and what we have to communicate? What would be the role could play the soft power in the perception of Spain abroad?
Well, Spain has soft power, but by that we mean cultural influence.
Yes, Cervantes and
yeah. Just look at the number of Hispanics in the United States, for example. There are more Hispanics in the United States than the total population of Spain. Yeah, this is a country that's doesn't have a military prowess, maybe because of the Franco regime, or maybe just because they don't want to spend much money on defense. It's a country that still has to project itself more, which has a lot going for it, and which a lot is not known. I mean, the Cervantes Institute is an example of this. It started in 1992. This is your 92 or 91? 91.
91. No? We are on a 30th anniversary.
Anniversary, exactly. Yeah. So you know what this is all about. To some extent, following the example of the British Council, although the British Council seems to me to be ailing these days, while the Institute Cervantes seems to be going up, although you have a much smaller budget than the British Council. Yeah, I'm waffling a bit on soft power because I don't really know how to explain the Spanish elements of it, except that, you know, we have good cinema and we produce good novelists and all that kind of stuff. But I think the essential thing about Spain is that it is a welcoming country, despite its past of having expelled so many people. If you look at Spanish history, the expulsion of the Jews, the expulsion of the Muslims, the political expulsions during the Franco regime, or the economic expulsions. I mean, don't forget, you know, well over 1 million people emigrated in the 50s and 60s to France and Switzerland and place for economic reasons, let alone the 500,000 people, I think in net terms, who left after the Civil War. And with that historical background, it is, I think, surprising that Spain has turned itself around and has become a welcoming country, as opposed to one that expelled people in one way or another.
It's history.
Yeah.
It's part of our history. Yeah. So thank you. Now we have the questions from our audience. The first question is from Geoff. He says, my neighbor said to me, no soy español, soy valenciano. How do you see the tension between centralism and regionalism?
Well, that's a good question, because it's true. If you pick out a Spaniard and say, where'd you come from? They say, I'm Basque, I'm Catalan, or they might even say, I'm from Albacete, you know, or wherever. Yeah, the Richard Ford, who wrote the wonderful Handbook of Spain, was published in 1846, in which I recommend anyone who's interested in Spain buy, because it's quite amazing if you read that, how many things have not changed. Said something along the lines of that Spain was a nation of regions held together by a rope of sand. And what he said this in in the 19th century. What he meant by that was this very tenuous relations between the center and the periphery. Look what's happening in Catalonia, which not only has, well, more than its tense relations have arrived at the point where it's trying to break away from Spain. A totally mad thing. Incidentally, people listening in might not be aware of the fact that the Catalan election was held on February the 4th, I think it was. And here we are today, and we still don't have a Catalan government. And it's because the two independence parties can't agree on their strategy. If anyone wanted a condemnation of the Catalan issue, I think there it is, 2 months afterwards. And if we haven't got a government in Catalonia. And so things like education, health, and other things are being basically ignored, which I think are far more important to most people than the independence issue. And if by May 26, these two parties, the Esquerra Republicana and the Junts, have not agreed on a new government, we will have another election in Catalonia. Total madness. But yes, it is very, I claim this is an extremely difficult country to live. If you're in Madrid as the prime minister ruling from the center, and it is physically the very center of Spain, not only the central government, but it's geographically it's the center of Spain. It is very difficult to govern, for the good of everybody.
Yes. Another question is, I think it's from the same person. Says, a French living in Sevilla claims there are far more regional conflicts in Spain than in the UK. Would you agree with this?
Well, I have lived in the UK for more than 35 years, so I'm not aware of any regional conflicts in Spain. I mean, sorry, in the UK, and there are lots of them in Spain. So, yeah, it's an odd question, really, because we don't have a system of regional governments in the UK along the lines that we have here. I mean, Spain is one of the most devolved countries in the world. Yeah, I don't think it's worked out to the satisfaction of everyone. Witnessed what's happening in Catalonia, and independence bubbles away in the Basque Country, but they'd be much more intelligent about it.
There is another question, but before I put this question, I want to say to our audience, I forgot to say that if you want to ask in Spanish, it is possible also. I will put the question in Spanish or in English. So feel free to ask if you want in Spanish. And the next question is from, it's a comment, I think Kevin Dune says, thank you both for a fascinating conversation. I was struck by William's comment on the failures of the political class in Spain and elsewhere. In the case of Spain, does William have a view of how differently the PostFranco transition might have been handled?
No, I think it was handled in the only way it could be done. I think the transition had to be done from within the system and not from outside. This goes back to the initial idea of the Communist Party was to have a ruptura, as they call it, which would like a sort of total clean break, as opposed to what the socialists were arguing for, and along with others, which was a basically negotiated break with the regime. A total break with the regime in 1975. Franco died in November 75, so let's say 1970 probably would have provoked the military. I mean, one should remember that when Franco died, there were scores of generals. By the way, there were far too many of them, but there were scores of generals who had fought in the Civil War on Franco's side, and with all the mentality that went with that. So to have had a complete rupture in 1976, along the lines of what happened in Portugal, for example, which had its revolution in 74, although interestingly it was essentially very non-violent, would not have been the case in Spain. I mean, Spain, you always have to, I think, remember that this country had a 3-year civil war, which Portugal did not have. And this conditioned, I think, the transition. So the idea that they could be, oh, well, Franco's dead, we'll wake up, right, okay, we're going to legalize all parties overnight, trade unions legal overnight, this and that, and it was simply not going to happen. And the king was essentially the one moving this. The king knew that without democracy, he would have been without a job. He had to look at what happened to his wife's Greek family, and it had to be negotiated, but which didn't mean giving in to the Franco status quo that remained after Franco. They meant obviously involving everybody. But a clean break, in my view, would have been impossible and would have probably been bloody.
Okay, I think that was there are not any other questions from the public. Yes, there is one question from Stephen Hart. He says, was Philip IV the 400th anniversary of whose accession to the throne is celebrated this year a good or a bad king?
Poof. Philip IV doesn't get many pages in my book, so I have to pass on that question.
Okay.
I have to pass on that question.
Okay.
But I think I might make a fool of myself.
Yeah. Okay. There is a comment from Kevin Dune. Thank you for the interesting reply to the transition. I can't help thinking that there are many similarities between Spain and Poland, a country I know quite well. I will simply say that Poland's political class is failing as badly as Spain. That's just a comment. So if there are not any other comments, muchísimas gracias, William.
Is there one here from Matthew Jarvis?
Yes. Could you comment on feelings towards the European Union in Spain, most pro-European country?
Yeah, Spain remains not as pro-European today as it was after Franco, but it's this, and surveys show this, it is one of the most pro-Europe countries. And I think that's for very good reasons and very obvious reasons. The word Europe or European Union or European Community, as it was when Franco died, was very much associated with democracy. The two were basically hand in hand. Joining the European Union, it was the European Community in '86, was basically the once you were in that club, for particularly the generation of Felipe González, so people in their 70s who would have been born, would have been too young to have experienced a civil war, but would have grown up under Francoism. For them, entry into the European club was the seal of approval of Spain's democracy, that they had made it. And remember, Spain under Franco had tried to get into the European community under an application or applications made in the 60s. And I think I'm right in saying that Brussels didn't even bother to reply to the application. There was no way that Spain was going to get in. It had a trade agreement, but that's not the same as being a full member.
Yes.
So yes, the country remains very pro-Europe. Even Vox on the extreme right here, unlike other right-wing parties, has not yet anyway sort of moved the anti Europe issue, as was done by the Conservative Party in the UK.
There is another question from Michelle. She says, how has Spain dealt with this colonial past? Could the United Kingdom learn something from it?
Well, I think they're very different colonial pasts. And I have to just simplify and generalize here. I mean, in Spain's case, a large part of the colonization of Latin America, all virtually everywhere except Brazil, was in the name of God, in the name of converting people to Catholicism. It wasn't a purely economic plunder. It was, saving souls in the view of the conquistadores, making them Catholics, as opposed to not just ripping off their silver mines in Peru, which of course happened. And the British colonial empire was of a different nature. So I don't know whether one country has anything to learn from the other at all. Spain, I think, has handled its colonial past quite well. Mexican president anyway, maybe not Mexico as a whole, Mexican president raises this issue from time to time and calls for the Spanish government to publicly apologize for its rape and plunder and pillage of Mexico. And it basically gets ignored in Madrid. And it's a sort of populist rallying point, in the view, done by the Mexican president, which is not, I think, taken seriously.
Thank you. I think that was the last question. Thank you very much, Willaim. It was a great, wonderful presentation. We are very honored, and I hope we can repeat the experience with some of your books in the future. Muchísimas gracias. Ha sido una presentación realmente fantástica de tu libro. Un gran honor para el Instituto Cervantes y esperamos en el futuro poder contar con tu presencia para presentar alguna de tus otras obras o para alguna conferencia, porque el trabajo también de análisis que haces en el Instituto Elcano es excelente, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, creo que vamos a tener oportunidades. Muchísimas gracias.
Mucho gusto. Gracias.